Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Charles McLachlan. We're meeting for the first time, and I'm glad that you're here, Charles. And
Great to be with you, Ed.
and I'd like to know who you are and what you do, because I have no idea. We,
Okay.
we really, literally are just meeting for the first time. So I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Well, my elevated picture is I talk to people and I sometimes get paid.
That's a nice idea. So why do they pay you?
Well, what I realized was that I really enjoy the interaction with other people. I really enjoy helping people, but I also enjoy using frameworks and models to get people to engage. And the focus that I've had more recently has been helping people to transition from full-time, permanent, salaried employment, where too often they're in a world of toil and control and fear, and step out to have a different kind of second half career. And that's been my focus, supporting them to make a transition to become an independent professional working as a what's called a fractional executive or portfolio executive.
Yeah.
We bring that 20 or 30 years of experience they've got to a number of smaller organizations rather than being locked into one corporate employer. And it's been really exciting to see how people grow and develop and how that frees up their time and their minds to do more of what they love, do more with the people they love, and to make more of a difference in the things they care about. And that's really, I suppose, what I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. And one of the things that I think this reflects is the fact that all of the old certainties have completely broken down. And the military had a term for this new world, which they call VUCA, where the landscape is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And some of that thinking has moved into the corporate world, but I don't think the corporate world have really got the right answer. So in the corporate role, they say the way you deal with the volatile is you need to just have a strong vision. The way you need to deal with the uncertainty is to have deep understanding. The way you need to deal with the complexities to build real clarity. And the way you deal with ambiguity is to be more agile. But fundamentally, I think that actually is not a reality for most people. That's not an approach that can really work. It looks great in the sort of management consulting manuals, but I think there's a very different kind of model that allows you to respond to this world. And part of what I've been doing is trying to grow people who step out of that corporate world and start to think about what it means to lead as a portfolio executive in this uncertain world with smaller organizations that can get blown about so much by what's going on outside. And what I've been encouraging them to do is offer themselves as leaders who can present with some vulnerability. I don't always have all the answers. I do get things wrong. We're on this journey together. And I've got weaknesses as well as strengths. And I think that response of vulnerability actually transforms the relationships you have with other people. And what it enables you to do is then to build unity, to have this sense of shared purpose that even if you disagree with one another, you are committed to one another. And once you start to build that unity, then you're in a place where you can engage with community. And there's been a lot of work done on the wisdom of crowds. I think what community does is give you something which is much more organic and much more able to morph and change and evolve in response to external circumstances. And so with the fractional executives, the portfolio executives I'm working with, we've established a community, we build connections, we support one another, we share our wisdom with one another. It doesn't mean that we're all aligned, that we're all trying to build the same future, but it does mean there's something that we share, which is to have this different work style and support one another in building that. But the final thing I think that I've found is really, really important is acceptance. And that might sound a really strange word in a commercial, corporate, entrepreneurial context. But I think too many people I've seen in corporate life have believed that every problem can be solved by working harder or smarter. But actually, there's some things that cannot be solved. And the way to respond to that, the most powerful way to respond to that, is to accept there's some things outside your control. To accept that there's some things where you can move around them, but you can't necessarily change them. And so when you look at our volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, I think the way that we can build a life and a work style and a future that gives us the greatest opportunity to have things we really want and the things we really need is to step into that mindset that even though you've got years of experience, lots of professional skills, you can offer that vulnerability to other people. And even though you may understand all sorts of things, actually building unity is much more powerful than being right. And in a world which is complex, clarity can help, but actually the wisdom of crowds, the community, the shared sense of purpose is what's really going to carry you through. And finally, in a world that's ambiguous, it might be that being more agile will help, but actually accepting there's some things that you can't know and some things you can't change really helps. So that power of acceptance. And what I've seen as I've worked with these fractional executives, as I've worked with CEOs of smaller businesses, and we build community and we build a shared sense of purpose, is this enables them to ride the waves in a very different way, to respond to changes in their environment, to respond to personal tragedy, to respond to great opportunities, which actually this military or corporate response is not nearly as powerful. So a lot of that underpins my philosophy of life, I suppose. I'm interested really in how many other people are starting to think this way, starting to move this way.
Well, you raised a lot of questions for me. I remember the first time I came across the term VUCA. And when I saw a presentation on it, I was at a conference, I saw a presentation. And I said, I thought, well, this is nothing new. This is the way it's been throughout my entire life, my career. I mean, so what is this? What's going on here? And is this just I know people, I have friends who work in this world, so I'm not being negative towards them or critical or judgmental. I'm just saying that it felt like this was just another gimmick. that was being thrust as a way to justify consulting firms. I was a consultant, consulting firms, um, justifying consulting firms work for companies, and and I'm certain that all those four things are true in one way or another in many places, but it just felt there was it just kind of felt to me inauthentic in a sense. It was just too kind of pat and too easy to describe, and therefore it wasn't going to have the effect that it needed to. Of course, I'm going back to really to the mid 80s when I began leadership work and realized that I disagreed with almost everything I read about leadership. So,
But I think that just to sort of open the debate up a little bit, when I first got involved with big consulting, which was quite late in my career, it seemed to me that the fundamental premise of consulting in those days had come out of time and motion studies, which assumed that people are just substitutable mechanics.
right.
And you've got a machine, and unfortunately, the machines can't do everything. So you have people, but you turn them into machines and you treat them like machines, and you manage them like machines, and then you get the right result. And then that whole thing relies upon command and control.
Right.
And so I can see that for big consulting firms, when there were other things happening, and that story no longer made any sense to the people they were trying to serve, they had to find something else, and they had to justify why almost 60 or 70 years of time and motion based consulting should be thrown away, and they had to tell a new story. And you still look at consulting firms and they're still doing time and motion type stuff.
Yeah.
But this is just the sort of the extra stuff on the top that they can charge even more for. So I do think it does come out of that post-industrial transition, and a world in which you can't get the best value out of people and what you're doing by treating them as machines.
Well, this is a huge transition, and that I've yet to feel that we have appreciated sufficiently, because what we're saying is that we're moving from an environment which is very mechanized thinking, machine oriented, to something that is more community, more relationship oriented. And the challenge is not at the ideological level. I can see how we can move from machine thinking to relationship thinking. That's relatively easy. The problem is, what does the structure of an organization look like when you begin to place at the center of the institution the relationships between all the people?
Yeah, and I think that the bottom line is it's not an organization. It becomes an organism. In the UK, we've got something called the National Health Service. And when I first got involved with a business that was doing executive coaching, the founders had done a lot of work with the NHS, and the National Health Service in England, is a big organization. At one point, it had more employees than any other organization except the Red Army in China. And they always wanted to keep changing. And the leader of this business that I came in to support used to say to me, you can't think of it as an organization. You have to think it as an organism. And like any organism, it's got a very good immune system to resist change and foreign bodies. And And that's what we've seen with this huge organization. Successive governments have tried to change it. They've tried to put big computer systems in there. They've tried the sort of top-down command and control, and this organism, has effectively rejected this foreign interference. And so fundamentally, something that grew out initially of a community-based activity. So, healthcare used to be done by religious orders, used to be done by individual practitioners, used to be a community activity, and a lot of the healthcare was provided by family members. In some way, they've lost the plot. And they're beginning, I think, at some level to recognize that actually we need to go back to communities of professionals rather than managerialism. We need to move back to engaging groups of people to support one another rather than rely upon doctors or nurses to tell you what to do. And that seems to me to be much more the direction that is solving some of these complex problems. But organizations don't hack it anymore. I don't think that for these kinds of problems, a conventional organization works.
So the people that you're working with who take on fractional executive positions,
Yeah.
I've received requests for me to consider that sort of thing. I'm not really suited to that. I don't think they understand who I am, first of all, but that's okay. But to me, I borrow this term from ministry, because I'm a Presbyterian minister, retired Presbyterian minister, and in that world, and I was consulting with churches more than anything, and in that world, you'll have a pastor of a church, and the pastor then is called to another church or is relocated to another church, and there will be what is called an interim or a transitional minister who will be hired, who comes in, and their role is to help the congregation process its self-understanding so that they can decide, what are we looking for in our next minister? And that interim or that transitional minister may be there for 2 years, engaging in that conversation so that when they call the next person, they're coming into a situation where both sides, the minister and the congregation, know what is expected. And it sounds like this is kind of what a fractional executive can be doing, which is kind of negotiating the transitional moments that a company is going to be going through as it moves from being an organization to be recognizing itself as an organism.
Well, I think that is part of what's going on. I mean, because these are smaller organizations, and because they're trying to grow, then organizationally, they're going through a whole series of cycles of transition and metamorphosis. And as the fractional executive, they have got 20, 30 plus years experience in being, I don't know, a finance professional or a marketing professional, whatever. And they can see these journeys and they can support the leaders on these journeys, bringing in their particular expertise. And that's what makes it very organic. My view is that those smaller organizations that are going to be successful it's not necessarily going to be that they have massive scale in terms of hundreds of thousands of employees.
Right.
It's that they're going to have massive impact because they've got some way of multiplying the insights they've got and making them available to a wide number of people. And the example I give when people say, Charles, this all sounds a bit strange, the example I give is, I don't know if you've heard of the hospice movement, but the hospice movement was founded by one individual who wanted to create an environment where people could die with dignity and support end-of-life care. She only ever had one hospice. She didn't try and create a network of them across the world. She didn't try and, reproduce herself and create a cookie cutter sort of franchise everywhere in the world. She just had this extraordinary exemplar and then built a community of practice and guided that community of practice to recognize that in different cultures, the way that you do end-of-life care would be different. And for those cultures to make their own form of end-of-life care. So she had extraordinary influence, created a whole new way of thinking about how you support people at end of life when you have a sort of medical model. And yet she only ever had one hospice. And that's the kind of thing that I think you can build out of this idea that you offer the vulnerability that you don't have all the answers. You try and build unity of relationships. And then out of that, you can establish community where you've got a set of people, it might be called a movement or a community, but they're a diverse set of people seeking a similar kind of outcome. And then, end of life care is all about acceptance. That's absolutely fundamental to it. The acceptance that you're not going to cure these people, acceptance that actually what you're offering is something that recognizes this person is not going to live forever, recognizes that there's limits to what you can do.
Somewhere in there's a connective link between this woman who started her one hospice and other people who are hearing her story and are starting their hospice. And so how does that network link happen? What do you see that's taking place there?
Well, I think it's seeing things as, it's about carrying things with a passion. It's about being very open to share what you've got. And then it's building relationships of trust. Because I think if she had felt that she has to hang on to this because it's her intellectual property that she can't give away to anybody else, and she's going to build a worldwide corporation that's going to give everybody a uniform experience, then it wouldn't have had the same impact. And so, but it's the trust, I think. And people would come and they would train in her skills and her approach and then go out and find their own way of doing it. It's that whole ability to release people rather than control people.
So we really are talking about the world of networks and the network effect of relationships and relationships of trust, but also relationships of support, relationships of information sharing, of openness. All the things that are baked into this podcast, is all those things are baked into this, and it's baked into the work that I've been doing for almost 40 years. when I wrote.
But the sad thing, I think, is that too many people hear the word network effect and they think the answer is to make a lot of money by creating a platform
Right.
which taxes everybody who wants to be in the network.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm talking about. So when I wrote this, my purpose was to support leaders and their organizations to strengthen their communities and their families. That was my purpose. My goal, as it turned out, was to move 1% of the world's population to take personal initiative to create impact in their local communities. And people would say, well, how are you going to do that? I said, I'm not. It either happens or it won't. It'll happen because I've shared this idea. I'll talk about it. I will continue to talk about it. But I'm not trying to scale this thing because I don't know how to do that. That's not who I am. I'm going to have my conversation with Charles today, and I'm going to have a couple of conversations tomorrow, and I'll just tell the story or I'll tell something. And when people say, well, can you help me? I said, yeah, I can help you. But it's something totally antithetical to the modern world, I think. That we are basing our work now on how we interact with each other.
Yes. About 15, perhaps 20 years ago, no, 15 years ago, I got involved with an organization that you may have heard of called BNI, Business Networking International, founded in the States, and their strapline is givers gain. So the more you give, the more you are likely to gain. And they built, a really powerful franchise system, and they've taken this idea across the world, and they have empowered hundreds of thousands of small business owners to find business through networks. Now, the interesting thing about BNI, from the experience that I had, was had a very, very rigid process. So you had to follow all the rules. And if you followed all the rules, then actually it worked and it thrived because it ended up attracting people who would follow the rules, and it all built, and it was extraordinary. But what BNI demonstrated is that there's all sorts of different ways of doing networking. And so from that, lots of other people started networking group with different style and different approach. And so there you had a really rigid organization inspiring other organizations, and building a whole new sort of network of intentional networking. But fundamentally, that principle of givers gain shifted the attitude people had to how they were going to go and win new business. And I found that really, really interesting to see how that shifts. And I know if I meet somebody who's been trained at BNI, they'll have a completely different attitude to how they do business than somebody who has come up and felt that everything is a competition, a zero-sum game. If you've got something, I can't have it. And which is completely antithetical to actually how networks can grow.
Right. I totally agree. So I'm calling it a transition that we're in, and it's historic. It's I would say it's at the level of an epoch transition where something that we've known for thousands of years is now becoming unworkable, which is that mechanistic approach to top-down leadership and bottom-up followership. And it's not that people don't follow, and it's not that they don't lead anymore. It's that they're both leading and following at the same time now. And do the people that you're working with, the people who become these fractional executives, what is it? What is the beginning point, the instigating point for them when they decide that they're going to be different than they have been up to this point in their career? What typically is that moment of transition?
Well, I wish I could be absolutely sure every single time, because spotting when people get to that point is quite hard. But actually, I don't think it's just one thing. So I think people get to a stage in their careers where they just ask themselves, what's my future going to look like if I carry on carrying on?
Yeah.
And the things they start to notice is my peers are getting weeded out every single time there's a corporate transition. So I've got no security of employment. They're seeing people who have a cliff edge retirement event and they're not going to have enough money to have the latter years that they want to. They're recognizing that we're no longer in a world where, you know, you retire at 60 and you die at 70. We're in a world where you can be active and productive and engaged into your mid 80s. But if your pension plan was on the basis that, you know, you're going to retire at 60, you've now got 30 years with inflation that's not going to cover it. And they're just tired often. They're tired of the rubbish that happens in corporate environments where too much of their activity is not meaningful, not relevant, is just feeding the machine rather than bringing an outcome. And then there are other pressures like individuals who are getting married who got married for a second time, and they're in their mid 50s and they've got children under the age of 10, and they're thinking, hang on, 15 years before they get out of college, I'm 70 then, how's this all going to work?
Yeah.
So that, or they're what you might call the sandwich generation. So they've got not only have they got those children, but they've also got elderly parents that they're going to have to care for, and they can't make all of that work full time. So there's a whole set of things, but I think fundamentally what I see is people are starting to reject a world in which work is toil, it's slavery, and they are held in place by fear. And if you look at the much younger generations, they've already rejected that. A lot of them have said, I'm not buying into this. They're not prepared to buy into that world. They are doing this kind of fractional stuff themselves because they've always got a side hustle. They don't stay in a job too long. They're always moving on. They're always doing the next thing. But the sad thing that I've seen with the people that I've talked to is they're ill-equipped to build strong, lasting relationships because they've been in a world where everything's mediated by technology. And so that's quite challenging. You talk about this shift. So if this is a world shift, yet the generations that are coming through have had less experience of building and learning how to operate in a relational context and having a shared life together, than people who are 20, 30, 40 years older.
I see exactly what you're saying. And I see it in its distinctiveness for each generation. It's different for each generation. I mean, for decades, I've recognized that the 40s is a transition point for most people. You know, they've done their 20, 25 years of their first job, and now they're thinking, am I going to do this for another 20 years and then retire, or 25 years and retire, or do I want to go do something else, or am I bored, or am I running out of the optimum time to advance myself financially? Because I think, and you can correct me, please, if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the only way you advance financially is by moving from one company to the next. You don't move vertically any longer. You don't financially benefit by vertically moving up through an organization any longer.
It's very hard to. I mean, some people do, but it's much harder.
You're the exception.
Yeah.
When I've talked with people, I talk with say millennials and Gen Zers, and they talk about how disappointed they are with the world the way it is, and they feel ill prepared. And then the people that hire them are complaining about how ill prepared they are to work, you know, and their self-awareness is that they don't see that they were the ones who created the circumstances where these younger generations are incapable of doing the work that they really need to be doing. So I think what you're doing is really important, but there's a a kind of a catastrophe unfolding where we really need to come together and say, how do we build new strengths for people to find jobs and to work? And there's a crisis about work, I think, in the world today. And maybe that's a way of talking about it.
Well, I suppose, you know, if you're a retired Presbyterian minister, then maybe one way of thinking about work is when Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, initially, work was a pleasure.
Right.
And then work became a curse.
Right.
But as I understand the way that people explain things, Jesus was meant to break that curse, and we should be in a world in which work is a pleasure. It's something that is giving us life rather than death.
Well, for some of us, it is a pleasure. Some of us have found that. And it's because somebody has helped us to find that. And so whatever the language we use can get kind of get messy. But the reality is that for many people, they have found that thing that they love, that thing that gives them a career that they wanted. But part of the reality of that, I would say, is that you don't find it you may not even find it by the things you've been trained to do. You're finding it by the things that you learn to love to do. And you can only do that by experimenting and by trying things. And that takes risk. And I mean,
Yeah, but I think there's another. So I completely agree with you, but I think there's also another thing going on.
okay.
So I don't know how true it is in the US, but in the UK, I would say that we used to have a culture where professionals were respected as individual practitioners, and they guarded their reputations. Whether it was accountants or doctors or teachers, or whatever. Now I think those people are being, I won't put it any, yeah, I'll put it as strongly as being cursed by what I call managerialism. So they're no longer trusted to do the right thing. Everything they do needs to be managed, needs to be inspected, needs to be counted, needs to be measured. And all of that activity to measure and count and control them actually consumes a lot of their time. When my father was dying on a ward in a very, very good hospital, you would see that the nurses and the doctors spent almost all of their time in front of a computer.
Mm-hmm.
It was only the most junior people who had any contact with the patients on an ongoing basis. So you had these patients sitting in a room, pretty much ignored, while the staff did stuff on computers. And yes, they were given drugs, and I'm sure they were doing a great job. But the truth was, in terms of care, it wasn't care. It was a set of medical interventions that were meant to try and create a medical outcome.
Yeah, you see the same thing here. We're it's pretty consistent here too. But
If you want to be a teacher, you might love teaching children, but actually quite quickly in your career, you're going to realize that you have to spend all of this time doing the paperwork, exhausting yourself. And as you get more senior, you end up doing more and more paperwork and less contact with children. And that opportunity for the inspirational teacher from the past is lost. I mean, yes, you may not have bad teachers. They might get weeded out, or they might not, because if they just follow the rules, they can probably stay there. But the opportunity for the inspirational teacher to thrive is just destroyed by that managerialism.
I do think that that's a part of what we're dealing with. I think you're exactly right, and I think one of the things that it has eroded, and I'm going back to an essay that was written in the early '60s by Edward Shills called "Center and Periphery," and what he describes is that society has a center to it, and the leaders of society are the leaders of society because they are there as much as anything to be the ones who preserve the value system of society. And they're the ones we look to as the caretakers of society, as the ones who will act responsibly for the benefit of the whole of society. And what I see has happened is that class of people who are at the top, who are the managerial, I think Peter Drucker called them the managerial elite. I think that was his phrase. Have abandoned that value structure, and as a result, the people who are at the periphery, I certainly see myself as at the periphery of this scenario, find that they are no longer have a connection to the center of society, that they no longer belong to it. And as I've thought about this, it occurred to me that when that happens, when the center can no longer hold, that you begin to build these smaller centers out at the periphery, and then they become networked together out of necessity and out of need rather than out of design. And so I think that's the kind of the process we're going through, and we're going to see small little communities. We just use that word, but it's something similar to that, where people gather together, and we're gonna, and it's not network as in the mechanical sense of a network. It's a genuine network of relationships where, okay, we're going to take care of each other. We're going to take care of our community. What do we need to do together to do that?
Yeah, but there's two ways that can emerge. So one way that can emerge is through gang culture, through the kinds of scenarios that people are seeing in Haiti, and kinds of scenarios that people are seeing in other parts of Latin America, where actually the way that people look after each other is through criminal networks. And so this idea that, you might have a beneficial new culture, or it's not inevitable. Society can break down in different kinds of ways, and
I agree with you. Yeah, I see that too. Question is, how do those criminal networks sustain themselves? Because at the heart of those criminal networks is the threat of punishment, of exclusion, and the question is, are those sustainable over the long period of time? And they require a homogeneity that the old system, the old center and periphery, used to have, but no longer has. And so it just seems to me that we're constantly seeking for a way to unify society without all the tools that we need to unify it.
yeah.
Which to me just says, okay, we're in a transition, and this transition is going to take a while to go through, and we don't know where it ends up. And so what do we do in the interim? That's the big question. What am I going to do today? And what you're doing, let me just commend you for what you're doing, because you have found a niche which has the potential of having a huge effect upon companies and communities, simply because you're addressing something in a fresh and new way.
I think for me, the crucial thing is I want people to step out of a corporate life which is disabling and crippling them, and take control over their own futures and feel they've got the power to make their own future. And that's not for everybody. I mean, the reality is, some of the people I talk to, and we start working together, or we start talking about working together, they want the comfort of the cage, as I see it, of the corporate environment. And they're prepared to pay the cost of being in that cage, because actually, when you open the door to the cage and you show them there's a world outside, they don't see the cage as something that is constraining them. They see the cage as something that's protecting them.
Yeah. And I would guess is that for many of these people, we need to say, okay, but you need to do work that protects the cage from collapsing.
Yeah. And that's something that other people who are smarter and more committed than I am will do. But I find that kind of large organizational culture a place that I find it a place which is where I find it very difficult to make any kind of difference. And I find it very frustrating to be in. And I've only really been in that environment for a small part of my working life. And I got a lot of insight and learning for the first 2 or 3 years I was there. And then I was quite pleased that it came to an end to a couple of years later, because I felt that they wanted me to be somebody I wasn't, and they had no capacity to value me for who I was. And it was a world in which success relied upon being available for a very, very large number of hours of the week.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend who works in a global corporation. Well, I'm going to be very vague in describing this. And I was visiting him, and he opened up his notebook, and in it was his analysis and his perspective of the structure of this organization. And as we went through it, I kept asking these questions. No, you don't understand. You don't understand. You don't understand. So, well, tell me what I don't know. He says, this is the way they are, and they will always be this way, because they see that there is no need for them to be any other way, because for them to be any other way would mean that they just have to end the business. And that sense that the form of the business is so complete in its development that it has no place to go was shocking to me. And I suspect that there are many organizations that are like this, and the conversation we're having would not be understood by many people in their executive offices, because they see no need to change. They're profitable. They have money coming in. Nothing needs to change. So why would we change? It only increases our expense. It only makes us more vulnerable. All those sort of things. And so it's a dynamic situation where we can't see everything happening, I would say, or it's like there's an institutional decline. It's not going to happen in every institution, but it's going to happen in many. And the opportunity, the work you do, the work I do, is to encourage new ways of approaching how we operate a business.
So I'm just going to carry on talking to people and sometimes getting paid. I think that's what I'm learning from this conversation.
I think that's a good idea, and particularly about getting paid. I think that's a good idea, because that way you know that you are that they are receiving value. When they pay you, they're telling you, we receive value from what you do. So let me ask you this last question, and this has become a question that I'm asking most, not all, but most of my guests. So, do you have hope in the future, and in what? And if you do, where do you see that hope? What does that hope look like?
So I see hope in the future really about building these interdependent relationships of shared purpose and shared ethos. That's where I see the hope. And if you have people who are mobilized around wanting to make things better, and they support one another to be better, then I think that brings hope. And again and again, the seeds are really sown, in the micro. And whether it comes out of creating a great new way of being and doing things, or whether it's a negative thing, it still comes out of the micro.
Mm-hmm.
And to go back to the drugs world, they have a new substance that they're putting on the market all the time, which requires different people to be involved, different things to go on. And then they flex from selling drugs to selling people. And they are constantly evolving and developing. And they're supporting one another to do that. And yes, it may be having very negative effects on the world, but the same kinds of mechanisms where you replace fear and greed with care and support and mutuality, again and again, we've seen that can make a huge difference. So that's where my hope is. My hope is in what we do with 4 or 5, 7 or 8, 10 or 12 people, and how then that gets multiplied to slowly create a ripple of change.
I agree with you, and I share that same hope that the world will organically change from a grassroots level. And I know that people say, well, it never works that way. Well, it's just, if it hasn't worked that way, it's because the conditions were not right for it to work that way. I think we're moving into an environment where that the conditions are right, because the ties that bind people to businesses are breaking. And at the fundamental level, people are recognizing that they no longer share the value system of the companies that they work for. And that's a big motivating factor for leaving. It's a big motivating factor for Gen Zers and millennials not to continue to work for a company. That conflict of values is really, really important. And I think where we can build some of this strength or this initiative moving forward is to focus on what are the values which unite us together, and what are the values that we've been missing that we need to emphasize more. And I mean, you mentioned trust. That's a value. It's also an action. It's also something we do, something we share with one another. We're going to trust each other, but it's fundamentally a value that we say we want. I mean, I did a project for a company almost, I guess 18 years ago now. Hard to believe that. Where there was real problems in the relationship between the executive and the company, the rest of the, and the executive team was replaced with a new senior executive. He came in, he built relationships. They all knew him by his first name. He knew them by their first. He knew their children's names, and within 2 years, they had gone from this highly antagonistic relationship between the company and the union and its employees to being recognized by Forbes magazine as one of the 100 most trustworthy companies in the nation in 2 years. It convinced me that there is no obstacle that we cannot overcome if we're willing to work together to achieve that.
Great to end on a note of agreement.
Thank you, Charles, for being here. I love what you're doing, and I wish you well. I hope you're able to have the rest of a career where you're so proud of the work that you've done, because you really are able to see the impact that you're having. And
Thank you. And the only thing I would say is I gave up having a career a long time ago. I think the idea of a career actually is dead.
So is this a calling?
It's yeah, you could call it a calling. Yeah.
It's a mission?
Could be a mission. It could just be a matter of being awkward and provoking people.
Well, continue to do that, and we'll all benefit from it. Thank you again, Charles, for being here, and thank you everyone for watching, and hope this has brought some challenging thoughts to you. And maybe if you are interested, be in touch, and I'll be glad to connect you to Charles you can give me whatever information you want to provide in the show notes, and that way maybe you will become a fractional executive someday. That would be an exciting thing to see happen. So thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.